Hello, welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 210, and I am the show's host, Kyle. On this show, I want to talk about a brief ceasefire we had in the Afghan war. Of course, that war is the longest one in American history. However, to observe a religious holiday, there was a brief 3-day pause in fighting between the Taliban and the Afghan army. And so I think this is a good time just to talk about, peace, resolution, or whatever it would be that would finally possibly bring stability to Afghanistan, but at the very least allow withdrawal of U.S. troops from that country. For those of you interested in sharing the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com and libertarianinstitute.org. If you want to subscribe to the show, you could do that on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and by going to immersionnews.com, you could check out my brand new news website, and also you could find the show at the Immersion News page on both YouTube and BitChute. So before I jump into the Afghan stuff, I have a couple updates to some very recent episodes of the show. Of course, episode 209, I focused on the Yemen conflict and by the forces backed by Saudi Arabia and the UAE to take the city of Al-Hodeida from the Houthis. And for those of you who want more information on this attack, I go back to the last show. But on the last show, I kind of left off that the UAE-backed forces were sitting just outside and trying to attack the airport, which is on the southern end of the city. And it appears that they have finally done so, and Western media, including Reuters, is now reporting this. This is kind of the first hurdle that the UAE needed to clear. Now, one thing that I'm not reading in the Western media, but I am reading on sources like Twitter and Facebook from people on the ground in Yemen, is that they basically just decide to obliterate the airport in order to liberate it from the Houthis, or what they call liberate it. And so while they're able to take this territory, and kind of the next step is to then enter the residential areas of the city of Hodeida, it's certainly not a victory in that, the Hodeida airport is just sitting there, with maybe a few bullet holes in it, apparently has been quite damaged. Now, it's worth noting, too, that just because they have taken this position doesn't mean the Houthis can't launch some kind of counteroffensive and take it back. However, at least seems for now that is in the hands of the UAE-Saudi coalition with the internationally recognized government of Yemen, even though that government doesn't have a real strong foothold in the country. And in fact, it seems that the president of Yemen, Saady, has just in the past week been able to return to Yemen for the first time in quite some time to visit the country. He had been living in Saudi Arabia because it just wasn't safe enough for him to be in his, the country that he claimed to rule. Now, if we look at the example of the airport there as maybe some possible foreshadowing as for what the entire attack will look like, it's not a good sign, because if the Houthis are fighting to the point where Saudi Arabia and the UAE are carrying out massive airstrikes to what they will call liberate the area from the Houthis, this likely means that a lot of the infrastructure of the city will be destroyed that held 600,000 before the attack. And of course is home to the key port of Hodeida that services like 80% of the Yemeni population, importing most of the food and aid that these people need to survive. And again, you wind back to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 209, and check that out if you want more information on that topic. On Foreign Policy Focus, episode 207, and I'll link to both of those episodes in the show notes page, I had Brian Saady on the show to discuss the situation in Colombia with the upcoming elections that occurred on June 17th. In those elections, the right-wing candidate Iván Duque was the winner of the election and will be the next president of Colombia. Now, if you want, the detailed history there, of course, you got to go back and listen to that show. But briefly, what Brian explained is that Iván Duque is not a fan of the peace agreement with the FARC, and that there's historical precedents in Colombia that just because there's a peace agreement reached and some demilitarization, in fact, a lot of demilitarization has gone on by the FARC, doesn't mean that they can't one day pick up weapons and return to the warfare and insurgency and civil war situation in Colombia. So there's a lot of important stuff going on right there with Iván Duque, and we should keep our eye on what he's doing and how the Trump administration is reacting to his rule of Colombia. Also, report out that the United States has spent about $10 billion in the past 2 decades fighting the drug war in Colombia. I mean, this is just an insane amount of money. And to think of this is how much money the United States is pouring into Colombia in order to fight the drug war. Imagine how much drugs are being produced and how much of the Colombian economy must be within the black market. And having a market that must operate outside of the kind of legitimate established court systems and judicial systems of a country is just an absolute recipe for chaos. And of course, so much of these drugs is cocaine that ends up in America. And as I pointed out before on the show, I think one of the worst things America does with our drug war is we don't admit that, the American people have a drug problem and import billions of dollars worth of drugs every year. And while, the Americans are generally rich and America is a vast country with 300 million people and we're able to withstand this, it does seem to, sow a lot of chaos in the countries south of the United States. Last thing before I get into Afghanistan, and that is we have some updates on things going on in Israel. The first is an interesting story in the New Yorker, which I'll link to in the show notes page. But this story is about a historical, well, not necessarily historical, but a repeated agreement between the United States and Israel for the United States not to acknowledge Israel's nuclear weapon arsenal. In fact, the official position on the Israeli nuclear arsenal is that it doesn't exist, or they don't admit to it existing. So when you ask, you just kind of shrug your shoulders. And this is like a position of intentional ambiguity, which allows Israel to maintain its nuclear weapons, but at the same time not be subject to the rules of the NPT, because Israel is not a signatory of the NPT, although Iran is, which is amazing how the United States is constantly complaining about Iran's nuclear weapons program and not Israel's. But, allows Israel to at the same time hold this massive nuclear weapons arsenal that I believe there's about 200 weapons. I think the official numbers are a little bit lower, but Mordecai Sununu has said about 200, and so that seems to be the best guess that I could come up with. Anyways, the United States presidents, time after time, Bush, Clinton, Obama, etc., have all signed this letter saying that we agree not to expose the Israeli nuclear arsenal. And so, February of 2017, Benjamin Netanyahu makes a trip to the United States and presents Trump with this letter asking him to sign it. And I guess the Trump administration was pretty, displeased with this letter, as you may guess, because, imagine what a narcissist everybody says that Donald Trump is, and I'm sure he surrounds himself with somewhat similar people. And so I'm sure he took it as a great insult that here you have this little tiny country in the Middle East trying to direct the president of the United States to, sign his name saying that he's going to, abide by a certain policy just after he takes office. And I'm sure at least at the time and even now, Trump sees himself as the most powerful person in the world. Now, it's my understanding that Trump does end up signing the letter, and Trump hasn't acknowledged Israel's nuclear arsenal yet. However, the fact that this story got out is interesting to me. And I always like to have the opportunity to bring up that Israel does have a large nuclear arsenal. Some more current events. We have Israel carrying out bombings in Gaza, and they claim this is a response to what they call arson balloons and kites. I guess since the Palestinians are trapped in, the area of Gaza, there's about 2 million of them there. They, are in a open air prison, and this includes every man, woman, and child, 80% of which are refugees, and over 50% of which are under 18 years old, have started tying incendiary devices, not like a grenade or anything like that, but just like a burning piece of something, and they'll attach that to a balloon or a kite and let it fly. And I guess some of the times that these are actually kind of traveling a little bit and potentially starting small fires. Now, I haven't read of anybody being injured in any of these fires or killed in any of these fires or, doing a significant amount of property damage. However, you can see how this could be inconvenient. And I guess in what should be the predictable Israeli over-response, you have Israel carrying out airstrikes within Gaza to do what they call, stop these balloons from taking off. So, this just shows how completely ridiculous the situation is. The Palestinian quote-unquote Air Force is a bunch of balloons and kites. It's not even a bunch of little commercial toy drones. It's literally, burning embers attached to a balloon or a kite and, set adrift, hoping that they would land in, somebody's bush and cause them even the slightest inconvenience. So they have to acknowledge that their neighbors, the Palestinians, are living in what, I believe has fairly been called the world's largest open air prison. There's a proposed Israeli law, and to my knowledge, this hasn't, made any progress in the Knesset yet, but it's definitely something that we need to keep our eyes on and should be absolutely condemnable if it were to move forward. And that is, they're proposing a bill that would ban the filming of Israeli soldiers by what they call anti-Israeli or pro-Palestinian groups. Now, an anti-Israeli group is not, the KKK or a neo-Nazi party. It's rather Veterans for Peace, a United States group that actually went to the West Bank and went to a protest with the Tamimi family and produced a documentary that I'll link to in the show notes page, and I believe is very powerful. And if any of you got friends or family that are interested in that kind of documentary stuff, definitely worth checking out. But, this would be a huge detriment to the Palestinian cause because, they have no ability to fight back against the Israelis. They're completely outmatched. Israel receives $6 billion a year of aid from the United States, and that's military aid. And they have, their own booming economy, and since they're able to suppress and take all the good stuff or all the good Palestinian lands, these people are fairly rich and able to buy, a massive military that they use to suppress the Palestinians further. And so, really the only weapons that the Palestinians have are cameras and information. And, you could talk about the Gaza rockets or whatever, but every time they launch rockets out of Gaza, half of them don't even make it into what would be Israel and just land in somewhere in the Gaza Strip anyways. These rockets are tiny and fairly ineffective. And again, you also often have an Israeli F-35 then coming to drop 500-pound American-made bombs on, whatever they deem is a worthy or target following their rules of engagement, which could even, at times is a civilian target. Last thing I want to talk about is I read an interesting story about how the State Department at one time in the Trump administration was actually wanting to look into what Israel is doing to the Palestinians and kind of scrutinize Israel a little bit. And this was shut down by U.S. Ambassador to Israel, David Friedman. He's a longtime Trump associate and seems to absolutely know absolutely or next to nothing about the situation or why they aren't Egyptians. And so it just shows, like I said, he knows next to nothing about the situation. All right, finally into the Afghanistan stuff. So it's the Islamic Holy Month, and for the last 3 days of the Islamic Holy Month, actually the Afghan government, proposed a larger ceasefire, but the Taliban said imposed their own 3-day ceasefire for those days. And I can't think of another time during the Afghan Civil War that there was a ceasefire. I know in the past that, there's really been the idea of a fighting season where you have the spring offensive and the fighting goes through the summer and I guess the fall, but then, during the winter months, the fighting slows down a little bit. But here you have an actual ceasefire, and it got to the point where there were actually celebrations with both Afghan soldiers and Taliban soldiers interacting and getting along and, looking huggy and not like people who have been on the opposite sides of a very long war, a 17-year war. Now, ISIS wasn't a member of this ceasefire, and the Afghan government, the U.S. government, and the Taliban have all said that the ceasefire doesn't apply to ISIS-K, which is a group of Pakistani Trinki Taliban fighters that ended up in Afghanistan as refugees of Obama's drone war in Pakistan and are now kind of plaguing and wreaking havoc with suicide bombings and I guess present a problem for both the Taliban and the United States. In a way, I'm sure this makes it difficult for the actual civilians, especially the Nangarhar province where the ISIS-K affiliate operates most often. Because, they really don't get to let their guard down in the way that maybe people in other regions of Afghanistan were able to, just because they know the potential for strikes and bombings is still there. However, there were some people in Afghanistan who, got to, probably let their guard down a little bit for a few days. During that time, ISIS-K carried out a few suicide bombings, I think killing around 50 people in a combination of those bombings. I read a report that one of those bombings actually targeted a ceremony where both Taliban and Afghan soldiers were getting along. A new report says the United States has spent $8.6 billion on the drug war in Afghanistan. Of course, as y'all know, because me and Will Porter wrote an article on it, the Afghan opium crop was the biggest one ever in 2017. And so it's absolutely clear that the drug war, just like the war in Afghanistan as a whole, has been nothing short of an absolute failure. So another interesting story is that the United States was planning on building a hotel next to their embassy, I'm supposing somewhere around Kabul. Now, I'm sure this hotel was going to be big and swanky for all the foreigners coming in. However, the United States subsidized the hotel for a tune of $92 million, and I believe it was a Marriott hotel. But the hotel only got half completed and now just kind of sits there. But this is a bigger problem on top of everything else because now it's a potential site for like the Taliban or ISIS-K to exploit. Having an unfinished building right next door could be very dangerous. So it'll be interesting to see if the United States deals with the way it would deal with any inconvenient structure across the Middle East, which would just be to bomb it. I doubt it just because it's so close to the U.S. Embassy. And they'll probably spend another few $1 million deconstructing this building sometime in the near future. Hopefully that could happen and the bureaucracy doesn't tie it up too long. And either some Americans or other Western people end up getting killed because of this large unfinished project right next door. So I think it was probably Monday that the ceasefire actually ends up falling apart in Afghanistan. And when I say falling apart, it's not like, the Taliban carried out a sneak attack where they said we're under a ceasefire and then started attacking the Afghan soldiers. They said the ceasefire would last for 3 days, and after those 3 days, they carried out an attack that killed, according to the Afghan government, 20 Afghan soldiers. According to the head Afghan official in the province where the attack occurred, killed 30 Afghan soldiers. And according to a worker at a local hospital that was treating the injured and killed soldiers, say that more than 50 soldiers were killed. I kind of point out all those numbers just to show how difficult it is to try to understand what's going on in the Middle East and Afghanistan. Because realistically, this is the same side of the conflict. This is all in all the side of the Afghan government. It's their medical facility, it's their provincial leader, it's their government, and they all report different numbers. However, it does seem that we're back to fighting in Afghanistan. I hear reports that the Afghan government is looking to establish ceasefire with the Taliban. We'll see if that happens. And one of the real problems on this one is just you only get the one side of the conflict. And you really only get in the Western media what the Afghan government is saying. And so while it seems like they're being reasonable and saying, now at this point we just want peace and we want to stop fighting with the Taliban may have not a good reason to continue to kill people, but they may be able to point out why either the Afghan government's offer is disingenuous or it would put them at a significant disadvantage or put their people at risk, the people loyal to them, by agreeing to it. Something I talked about on the show a couple months ago, but I saw in the news again, and it was shocking to me. I saw it again. And there was the idea that I guess Saudi had floated, somebody within the Saudi administration have floated that said that they wanted to just turn Qatar into a island over a peninsula. And they would, I guess, do this by digging a canal along the Saudi-Qatari border. Now, it seems now that Saudi Arabia is actually taking bids on this project. It seems so ridiculous that in 2018, in a region where the southern country has millions of people starving to death, that you would undertake a massive project to cut a lane in between Qatar and Saudi Arabia in order to turn Qatar into an island. And it doesn't seem like it would have any real effect. I mean, just build a border fence there. It'd be a hell of a lot cheaper, I'm sure. And as pointed out, it's hard to see any logistical benefits because the Qatari Peninsula isn't that big to cutting this gap through it. So again, I can't imagine this gets done, but at the same time, I think it shows in some way just the maybe arrogance of the Saudi leadership at this point, specifically the Crown Prince, a very young man in his early 30s still, Mohammed bin Salman. Some North Korea news is that we have Kim Jong-un making another trip to China to meet with the Chinese President Xi. There they talked about North Korean denuclearization. Very interesting to see as we start to get the details of what this denuclearization is going to look like and what role China will play. We also have some unofficial, or I guess anonymous sources from the White House saying they expect the Koreans to start turning over the remains of American soldiers from the Korean War sometime soon. As I point out, I was really encouraged to see this in the negotiations just because this is a tangible benefit for the Americans. And while I'm sure the Trump administration is going to propagandize the hell out of the return of these soldiers and glorify them and, have maybe either the widows or the children or the grandchildren of these people show up to a ceremony and, say, I could finally give you peace and lay these kids to rest. I mean, I'm sure for some people this is going to be a very nice thing to know where their loved ones' remains are. And I think it's definitely a step in the right direction as far as North Korean and U.S. relations go. Got a story out that says Amazon is now the front runner to get a new Pentagon contract. It'll be a 10-year contract worth about $10 billion, and that is to provide cloud services to the Department of Defense. Of course, I hate it with these big tech companies getting in bed with the Pentagon. And while I'm not optimistic about Google's future commitment, to kind of stay out of Pentagon contracts, it does seem that enough employees resigning did cause them to come out and make a statement saying that about a year from now, they won't renew the contract for Operation Maven, which is a AI contract where Google is developing AI technology for U.S. drones for targeting purposes. I read another story out from Jason Ditt saying that the United States is conducting more offensives in cyber warfare, and I think this gets into why it's so dangerous with the tech companies getting in bed with the DoD. Is that, even myself and many other people really don't understand cyber warfare and what we're talking about here and what could potentially happen, lives lost and all that kind of stuff, or even how to identify these attacks. And yet, you're going to have the Pentagon getting in bed and paying out these large contracts to these tech companies, and then, carrying out offensive operations that are likely covert, will go unnoticed, but could wreak massive devastation in other countries. And, it's always bad for a new company to get on the, corporate welfare wagon. And there's poor people in the world if you really want to give other people's money away, or you could just not take everybody's money and, stop giving out these stupid contracts. Story from the UN is that the U.S. is withdrawing from the Human Rights Council. I think in a way the liberal media is probably making way too big of a deal out of this. They pretend, and nobody sets the context, that the Human Rights Council was actually formed in 2006 and the United States didn't join until Obama took office in 2009. However, this is over America's, supposed outrage that the Human Rights Council stands up for the Palestinians and waves their fingers at the Israelis every once in a while for killing innocent people. And it's just so amazing to me that, there's these U.S. officials out there like U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, who get so outraged over the fact that the Human Rights Council is condemning a sniper killing a young child. Last thing, the United States is creating a space force. This is like the dumbest idea I've ever heard. Terrible thing to weaponize space. We already have the Air Force, and I believe NASA is even a part of the Air Force if, that's kind of the direction you want to go. This is something that was actually shot down when it was proposed in the NDAA. General Mattis kind of said the United States didn't need it, and that we have a sufficient Air Force for this problem. Trump said it would be a separate branch, but equal branch to the Air Force. So, boondoggles and spending, and I'm sure Boeing and, people involved in the aerospace game are very happy because there's going to be a whole bunch of contracts coming out from the Space Force to all these companies. And, we're going to be the losers, all of us who pay tax money and, don't see any benefit from this kind of stuff. All right, that's where I'm wrap up the show. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. immersionnews.com is my news website. That's really cool, and you all should go check it out. You find the show on iTunes, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify. Leave me a rating and review there. If you go to YouTube and BitChute, the channel name is Immersion News. Subscribe, like the content, share it. Really appreciate it. And for those of you who really like the show and really want to support it, think about going to my Patreon page, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus, and donating to my show. All right, talk to you next week.